In the spring of 1940, British soldiers fighting in France began hearing a sound they would never forget. It wasn't artillery. It wasn't machine gun fire. It wasn't even the explosion. It was a scream, a terrifying howl that seemed to fall from the sky itself. Seconds later, bombs crashed into bridges. Columns of tanks erupted in flames. Roads vanished beneath clouds of smoke and dust. Entire defensive positions disappeared in moments. The aircraft responsible quickly earned a reputation unlike any other in Europe. The Junkers Ju-87. Stuka. To Allied soldiers, its arrival often meant disaster. Its accuracy seemed impossible. Its attacks felt unstoppable. And its terrifying sirens convinced many that the aircraft itself was screaming as it dived toward them. But behind that terrifying reputation was a strange contradiction. The Stuka was slow. It was lightly defended. And if enemy fighters managed to reach it, it could be frighteningly vulnerable. So how did an aircraft with such obvious weaknesses become one of the most feared weapons of the war? This is the story of the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, an aircraft that terrified Europe not because it could survive a fair fight, but because it was designed to make sure it rarely had to fight one. The Stuka had never been designed to dominate the sky. Its job was far more specific: find a target, destroy it with extraordinary precision, then leave before the enemy could respond. Everything about the aircraft reflected that single purpose. During the 1930s, military planners around the world struggled with one problem. Bombers had become larger. They carried heavier bomb loads, but they still struggled to hit relatively small targets. Bridges, railway junctions. Level bombing simply wasn't accurate enough. A bomb released from several thousand feet could miss by hundreds of meters. Against a city, that hardly mattered. Against a bridge, it mattered enormously. Germany believed there was another way. Instead of dropping bombs while flying level, why not point the entire airplane directly at the target? The concept became known as dive bombing. It demanded something most pilots considered almost insane. After locating the target, the pilot rolled the aircraft over, then pushed the nose almost straight toward the ground. The dive became steeper. The speed increased dramatically. The target filled the windscreen. Anti-aircraft fire exploded around the aircraft. The pilot ignored everything except the aiming point. Only at the last possible moment would he release the bomb and pull out of the dive. Too early, the bomb missed. Too late. The airplane hit the ground. From inside the cockpit, the experience was even more violent than it looked from the ground. As the aircraft rolled into its dive, the horizon seemed to rotate out of view. Suddenly, almost everything in front of the pilot was Earth. The target grew larger with terrifying speed. There was no time for broad corrections now. Every movement had to be deliberate. The pilot held the aircraft in its dive, watched the altitude fall, and kept the target lined up ahead. Then came the release. The bomb dropped away beneath the aircraft. But the most dangerous part wasn't over. The Stuka still had to escape the dive. As the aircraft pulled away from the ground, enormous forces pressed the pilot into his seat. His vision could begin to narrow. For a few brutal seconds, simply remaining conscious could become part of surviving the attack. To many airmen, deliberately pointing an aircraft at the ground looked almost suicidal. To German planners, it looked like the answer to an entirely different kind of war. The Luftwaffe wasn't preparing for another trench war like the First World War. It planned to fight fast. Its armies would advance with tanks, trucks, and mechanized infantry. Rather than bombing entire cities, it would eliminate individual targets standing directly in the army's path. It was flying artillery, only much faster. One of dive bombing's most influential German champions was First World War fighter ace Ernst Udet. During visits to the United States, Udet watched American pilots demonstrating dive bombing techniques. He returned convinced that Germany needed a dedicated dive bomber. If Germany wanted lightning-fast victories, It needed an aircraft capable of destroying critical targets with a single, well-placed bomb. Turning that conviction into a working aircraft took years of dangerous testing. The first Ju-87 prototype took to the air on September 17, 1935. It was an unforgiving aircraft to fly in those early years, and junkers needed pilots willing to push it to its limits. Among the test pilots who flew it during its pre-production trials was Hannah Reich. She would go on to become one of the most famous aviators in German history, and one of the only women ever to fly for the Luftwaffe in a testing capacity. Engineers refined the wings, adjusted the dive brakes, and strengthened weaknesses revealed during high-speed testing. The result was the Junkers Ju-87. At first glance, it looked unusual. Its fixed landing gear created extra drag. Its large inverted gull wings made it instantly recognizable. Compared with sleek fighters entering service around Europe, the Stuka appeared slow and awkward. But almost everything about that strange-looking aircraft existed for one purpose: putting a bomb exactly where its pilot wanted it. Every feature supported that goal. An automatic dive recovery system helped protect the aircraft if the pilot blacked out during pullout. Large dive brakes beneath the wings slowed the aircraft during its near-vertical descent, giving pilots precious extra seconds to aim. A pilot and rear gunner worked together inside the cockpit. The rear gunner's machine gun offered some protection from attacks behind, but only some. The Stuka's designers knew their aircraft couldn't defend itself against every threat. They were counting on something else to keep it alive: German fighters. As long as they controlled the sky, the Stuka could concentrate on the one thing it did extraordinarily well: attack the ground. It was a dangerous assumption, and in 1939, Germany was about to discover just how powerful that assumption could be. By the summer of 1939, that plan was about to be tested. On August 15th, just weeks before the invasion of Poland, the Luftwaffe staged a dive-bombing demonstration near Neuhammer am Quais for a group of senior German generals. Squadron after squadron of Ju-87s prepared to dive toward the range below, performing exactly the maneuver the aircraft had been built for. But low cloud had settled over the training ground that morning. 13. Stukas dove into the clouds during the demonstration and never pulled out. All 26 crew members were killed in what remains one of the deadliest peacetime accidents in Luftwaffe history. It happened just 18 days before the invasion of Poland began. 13 aircraft, 26 men, gone. And just 18 days later, the Stuka went to war. Then came September 1st, 1939. Germany invaded Poland. At around 4:40 in the morning, without warning and without a declaration of war, Stukas dove out of the sky, above a small Polish town called Wielun. The town had almost no military value. It had no significant garrison, no major factories. What it had was a hospital, clearly marked with red crosses on its roof. That hospital was one of the first targets struck. Over the next several hours, wave after wave of Ju-87s returned. Tens of thousands of kilograms of bombs fell on a town that could barely defend itself. By the time the attack ended, roughly 3/4 of Wielun had been destroyed. Hundreds of civilians were dead, with some estimates placing the toll above 1,000. And Wielun was only the beginning. Across the rest of Poland, the pattern repeated. Bridges were destroyed. Railway lines were cut. Retreating troops came under relentless attack from the air. To soldiers on the ground, it seemed as though the Luftwaffe could destroy almost anything it chose. The screaming dive became one of the defining sounds of Germany's new style of warfare. Soon, newspapers across Europe began reporting on the mysterious bomber whose terrifying howl seemed capable of breaking an army's morale before the bombs even exploded. By the end of the Polish campaign, the conclusion seemed obvious. The Stuka worked. It could strike precisely, support advancing troops, and spread panic far beyond the point where its bombs actually landed. To German commanders, the aircraft appeared to have proven itself, but Poland had hidden something, a weakness that hadn't mattered enough to stop the Stuka there. Because almost every condition had been in its favour, Germany's next campaign would make the Stuka even more famous. And that success would convince the Luftwaffe that its greatest weakness wasn't really a weakness at all. They were wrong. By the spring of 1940, the Stuka had become the face of Germany's lightning war. Wherever the Wehrmacht advanced, the U-87 seemed to appear overhead. Poland had fallen. Now France, Belgium and the Netherlands stood in its path. First came the scream, then the bombs, then the German tanks. And in France, the Stuka was about to show just how devastating that combination could be. What made the aircraft so effective wasn't its speed. It wasn't even its bomb load. It was its accuracy. A typical Stuka carried a single 500-kilogram bomb beneath the fuselage, sometimes accompanied by smaller bombs under the wings. That was far less than many larger bombers. A well-flown Stuka could deliver its bomb with extraordinary accuracy. For the commanders directing Germany's ground offensive, that level of accuracy was invaluable. But the hardest part came at the very bottom. Pulling out of the dive, the forces pushing against the pilot's body became enormous. Many described it as feeling like an invisible giant forcing them into their seats. Some even began losing their vision as blood drained from their heads. To reduce that risk, the Stuka included one of its most remarkable features, an automatic dive recovery system. If the pilot blacked out while pulling away from the ground, the system could help return the aircraft to level flight. And while that helped make the Stuka accurate, another feature helped make it infamous. Then there were the famous sirens. Known as the Jericho Trumpets, they were mounted on the aircraft's landing gear. As the Stuka entered its dive, the airflow caused the sirens to emit their terrifying scream. The sound echoed across battlefields long before the bombs struck. For soldiers experiencing it for the first time, the effect was chilling. German commanders hoped the psychological impact would weaken enemy morale before the attack even landed. In May 1940, they would see just how powerful that effect could become. The aircraft reached its greatest early successes during the invasion of France in May 1940. German armoured divisions pushed west at astonishing speed. Ground commanders quickly learned that air support could arrive within minutes. That close cooperation between aircraft and advancing tanks became one of Germany's greatest advantages. Nowhere was that clearer than at Sedan. On May 13, 1940, wave after wave of Stukas fell on the French troops defending the Meuse River. It was one of the heaviest air attacks the world had yet seen. For hours, the sirens screamed and the bombs rained down. The defenders weren't only bombarded, they were broken. Many fled their positions before German soldiers had even crossed the river. By nightfall, the French line had cracked wide open, and the road into France lay open. But Sedan revealed something important. The Stuka's real strength wasn't the aircraft alone. German forces made extensive use of radios to coordinate between ground units and aircraft. Forward observers could identify targets and quickly relay their locations. Instead of waiting hours for heavy artillery to arrive, commanders could request Stuka attacks that often appeared within a remarkably short time. The Stuka wasn't winning battles by itself. It was helping every part of the German military work together. That combination proved devastating. By late May, the German advance had pushed the British Expeditionary Force back to a single stretch of French coastline. Dunkirk. More than 300,000 British and French soldiers crowded onto the beaches, waiting for rescue. Hermann Göring believed the Luftwaffe alone could destroy them before a single man escaped. Stukas were sent to attack the harbour, the beaches and the ships, attempting the evacuation. From small civilian vessels to naval destroyers, anything involved in the evacuation could become a target. For the soldiers waiting their turn to board, the sound of the Stuka became inseparable from Dunkirk itself, the scream overhead. The mad scramble for cover on open sand with nowhere to hide, the bomb. And then, if you were fortunate, silence until the next wave arrived. Despite the onslaught, Goering's promise failed. Royal Air Force fighters, flying from bases just across the Channel, fought the Luftwaffe over the beaches. A hastily assembled fleet of naval and civilian vessels kept the evacuation running for 9 days. More than 330,000 men were brought home. The Stuka had failed to stop the evacuation, but that failure was easy to overlook. France was collapsing, and from almost every other angle, the aircraft still looked like a devastating success. As German victories mounted, the Ju-87's reputation grew almost as quickly. Newspapers described it as an unstoppable weapon. Newsreels showed dramatic dive attacks against bridges and fortifications. To civilians watching from home, the aircraft appeared almost invincible. But its victories still depended on one condition. German fighters had to control the skies. Without that protection, everything changed. But wars have a habit of changing, and after the fall of France, Germany prepared for an invasion that required something it had not yet faced: complete AIR superiority over Britain. To achieve it, the Luftwaffe would first have to defeat the Royal Air Force. Until now, the Stuka's greatest weakness had remained largely hidden behind German air superiority. Over Britain, there would be nowhere left to hide it. For the first time, the aircraft that had hunted armies across Europe was about to become the prey. Hitler's plan was simple. Before Germany could invade Britain, the Royal Air Force had to be destroyed. The Luftwaffe would sweep British fighters from the skies. Only then could German bombers attack freely. On paper, the Stuka seemed perfect for the task. Airfields, radar stations, ports and convoys were exactly the kind of precise targets it had been built to attack. German commanders believed the Ju-87 would once again play a decisive role. Unlike France, Britain had something Germany hadn't encountered before: an integrated air defence system. Along the English coastline stood a chain of radar stations capable of detecting incoming aircraft long before they reached land. Information flowed rapidly to Fighter Command headquarters. Within minutes, Hurricanes and Spitfires were climbing toward the incoming raids. The Stuka still performed brilliantly when it reached its target. Its dive bombing remained exceptionally accurate, but getting there was becoming increasingly difficult. Against modern fighters, it stood almost no chance. A Spitfire could overtake it with ease. A Hurricane could attack, climb away, and attack again, giving the rear gunner little chance to respond. The Stuka's single defensive machine gun offered little protection. British pilots quickly learned how to attack it. Rather than engaging the escorting Messerschmitt Bf-109s, many targeted the Stukas themselves. The dive bombers became the weakest part of the formation: slow, predictable, unable to maneuver aggressively while carrying bombs. Again and again, RAF fighters broke through the German escorts. Again and again, Stukas fell burning into the English Channel. Crews who had dominated the skies over France only weeks earlier suddenly found themselves struggling to survive. For a Stuka crew, the danger could arrive almost without warning. One moment, the formation was still heading toward its target. The next, the sky around it could erupt into twisting aircraft, tracer fire, and desperate evasive maneuvers. The rear gunner became the crew's last line of defense, watching the sky behind them while the pilot tried to keep the aircraft alive. But there was only so much he could do. The Stuka was still carrying the features that made it such a stable bombing platform. Against a fast fighter, those same qualities became a trap, and unlike the soldiers who had heard the sirens over Poland and France, RAF pilots had no reason to fear the sound. They were above it, faster than it, and increasingly, they were waiting for it. To a Spitfire pilot high above, that howl no longer signalled terror. It marked an easy target. Then came August 18th, 1940, a day that would expose the Stuka's vulnerability more brutally than almost any before it. It would later become known as the hardest day. That morning, Stukas were sent against British airfields along England's southern coast. More than 100 Ju-87s took part, the largest number the Luftwaffe had yet committed over Britain in a single operation. Hurricanes and Spitfires intercepted the incoming formations before many reached their targets. The escorts couldn't protect them all, and once RAF fighters reached the Stuka formations, the weakness built into the aircraft's design became brutally clear. The losses shocked the Luftwaffe. Across the Stuka formations that day, 16 Ju-87s were destroyed and several more damaged. Experienced crews, impossible to replace quickly, were gone. The Stuka could still destroy a target, but now it was becoming clear that reaching that target could cost more than the Luftwaffe could afford. The Stuka hadn't suddenly lost its accuracy. Its crews hadn't suddenly forgotten how to fly it. What had changed was the environment around them. Everything that made it deadly also made it vulnerable. Its large wings gave it superb control during steep dives, but they also created drag. Its fixed landing gear made the aircraft stronger and simpler to maintain, but it slowed the bomber dramatically. Its rear gunner could discourage attacks from behind. But he couldn't stop fast, heavily armed fighters. The Stuka had been designed around one assumption: German fighters would always control the skies. When that assumption disappeared, so did the aircraft's greatest advantage. Within weeks, Luftwaffe commanders reached an uncomfortable conclusion. The Ju-87 could no longer operate safely over southern England. Losses had become unsustainable. The aircraft was gradually withdrawn from the Battle of Britain. For many observers, that seemed like the end of the Stuka's story. RAF pilots believed they had defeated one of Hitler's most feared weapons. They weren't entirely wrong, but they weren't entirely right either, because Britain had proven something very specific. Without control of the sky, the Stuka was dangerously vulnerable, but that didn't mean the aircraft was useless. It meant it needed a battlefield where its greatest weakness could once again be protected. And less than a year later, Germany found one. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The Eastern Front stretched for thousands of miles. Unlike Britain, much of the fighting took place where German fighters could once again establish local air superiority. Suddenly, the conditions that had made the Stuka so effective returned. Wide-open battlefields, advancing armoured columns. It was the kind of battlefield the aircraft had been built to exploit, and within months, the Stuka would demonstrate that its precision could threaten targets far larger than anything it had attacked over France. September 1941. German forces were closing around Leningrad, but offshore, Soviet warships were using their heavy guns to support the city's defenders. Among them was the battleship Murat. More than 20,000 tons of steel, protected by heavy armour and armed with 12 massive guns. Destroying a target like that from the air was no simple task. But on September the 23rd, Stukas appeared above the Soviet naval base at Kronstadt. They began to dive. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky as the German aircraft descended toward the harbour. One after another, bombs fell around the Soviet ships. And then Murat was hit. A massive explosion tore through the forward section of the battleship. Smoke and debris erupted above the harbour as the bow was devastated and the ship settled into the shallow water beneath it. Now, the same basic idea, putting a bomb precisely onto a target from a steep dive, had helped cripple a battleship. But success like this could hide what was happening elsewhere on the Eastern Front. The conditions that had made these victories possible were already beginning to disappear. Soviet resistance was growing stronger. Enemy fighters were becoming increasingly dangerous, and the deeper Germany pushed into the Soviet Union, the harder those conditions became to recreate. The ones that had made the Stuka so devastating in 1939 and 1940. The aircraft could still be deadly, but increasingly it had to be used where its strengths mattered most. The Stuka was becoming a specialist, and as the war changed, that specialization would become even more extreme, because one version of the Stuka would abandon the weapon that had defined it from the very beginning, the bomb. In its place came two enormous 37mm cannons. The result was the Ju-87G, nicknamed the Kanonenvogel, the cannon bird. But turning a dive bomber into a tank hunter came at a price. The cannons were enormous. Heavy pods hung beneath the wings, adding weight and drag to an aircraft that had never been fast in the first place. Ammunition was limited. There was no room for careless shooting. A pilot had to find a tank, approach from a favourable angle, line up the target, and make the few opportunities he had count. And unlike the classic Stuka attack, this wasn't about releasing a bomb and pulling away from a steep dive. The gun-armed Stuka had to come down low enough to place cannon fire precisely onto an armoured vehicle. That meant flying closer to the battlefield itself. Closer to machine guns, closer to anti-aircraft fire, and still inside an aircraft whose greatest weakness had never disappeared. The Kanonenvogel was dangerous, but only in the hands of a pilot who could put those guns exactly where they mattered. Instead of diving toward bridges or buildings, pilots now searched for tanks. Pilots tried to strike the thinner armour on the top or rear of Soviet tanks. A well-placed burst could disable even heavily armoured Soviet vehicles. Once again, success depended on precision rather than speed. It was exactly the kind of mission the Stuka had always been designed for, and no pilot would push this new version of the Stuka further than Hans Ulrich Rudel. Throughout the war, Rudel flew an astonishing 2,530 combat missions. He claimed the destruction of more than 500 Soviet tanks, along with artillery batteries, trains, bridges and landing craft. And his connection to the Stuka's story went back even further, to the attack on Marat we saw just moments ago. Historians continue to debate some of the exact numbers. Rudel demonstrated something important. In the right hands, under the right conditions, the Stuka remained an exceptionally dangerous weapon until the very end of the war. In February 1945, with the Red Army closing in on Germany, anti-aircraft fire tore through his cockpit and shattered his right leg. Surgeons amputated the leg below the knee. Rudel was back in the cockpit within weeks, flying combat missions with a prosthetic limb strapped where his leg had been. But Rudel's extraordinary record could obscure a much larger truth about the aircraft he flew. The Stuka's effectiveness had never depended on the aircraft alone. In many ways, the Stuka was never really a standalone weapon. It was one piece of a much larger system. Its precision mattered because ground forces could tell it where to strike. Its vulnerability mattered less when German fighters kept enemy aircraft away. And its speed mattered less when the battlefield itself was moving in Germany's favour. When every part worked together, the results were spectacular. When they didn't, the Stuka paid the price. And that explains the contradiction at the heart of the Stuka. It could be both extraordinarily effective and extraordinarily vulnerable. It simply depended on the battle it was being asked to fight. Yet for all of that, the Stuka isn't remembered today for its radios, its dive breaks, or even its battlefield coordination. Popular culture remembers it above all for its terrifying dive sirens. The screaming sound that echoed across Europe became one of the defining images of the early war. In reality, those famous Jericho trumpets had very little effect on the aircraft's actual combat performance. In fact, many were removed later in the war because they created unnecessary drag and reduced speed. The psychological weapon that made the Stuka famous actually made it less effective. Yet by then, the legend had already been created. For countless Allied soldiers, hearing that scream was enough to trigger fear before the bombs had even fallen. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, around 6,500 Stukas had been built. The aircraft had served from the first day of the war in Poland until its final months defending Germany itself. Its career spanned Germany's greatest victories and its final defeat. It was designed to solve one very specific military problem: deliver a bomb with extraordinary accuracy in direct support of advancing ground forces. For several crucial years, it did that better than almost any aircraft in the world. The same design that made it almost defenseless in one battle made it terrifying in another. It wasn't a contradiction, it was a specialist. One that became legendary because it was used exactly as its designers intended, until the nature of the war changed. And perhaps that's why, more than 80 years later, the Stuka is remembered by something no specification sheet can capture. Not its speed, not its bomb load, not even its unmistakable shape, but a sound. The same terrifying scream that soldiers across Europe learned to recognize seconds before the bombs fell. Do you think the Stuka deserves its terrifying reputation, or was its legend bigger than its actual combat effectiveness? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the aircraft that shaped the Second World War, subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.